Okay, so the iPad Air has the M1 now, making it the cheapest way to get one of Apple's incredibly efficient and powerful chips. But can it replace the M1 MacBook Air, the laptop I've probably recommended more than any other in the past year? Let's find out. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, Baseus, for their new line of charging products, which you'll hear more about in just a bit. This is Luke with Digital Trends. Welcome back. And yes, we're going to tackle the age-old question of whether or not an iPad can replace a laptop. Apple loves to throw shade at chunky Windows laptops at comparable price points, which always is going to invite this comparison about what you can and can't do with an iPad. But let's get real. When I first heard that the iPad Air was getting the M1, I thought immediately of the M1 MacBook Air. It's a fantastic laptop for $1,000, primarily because of the M1. It's what turns this otherwise old laptop into something really special. The idea that the M1 could do something similar for the iPad Air certainly feels possible, at least in theory. This video is going to be much more about usability and real-life testing, not just comparing specs. And that's where this rivalry gets really interesting. And if that's the kind of thing you find helpful or just interesting, make sure to subscribe to our channel here on YouTube for more videos like this one. So let's talk about this new iPad. So the first issue of usability happens before you even wake up the device, and that's how the iPad Air feels to carry around, set up, and actually get started on whatever you're doing. So first, the iPad Air is 2.3 pounds with the tablet and Magic Keyboard combined. That's a ½ pound lighter than the MacBook Air, and that's a ½ pound less you have to carry around in your bag or just move around from place to place in your home or office. It also has an overall smaller footprint, though a slightly different shape thanks to the 4:3 aspect ratio of the screen, but more on that later. But when you do actually sit down, whether in a chair using one of the devices on your lap or at a desk, the iPad Air immediately becomes a little cumbersome. The lap situation is not great, and it's not because the base of the Magic Keyboard isn't sturdy. It totally is. It's really the size of this device that makes it sort of untenable to use on your lap. It's just not really wide enough to fit on your lap, and the palm rests are small enough that your wrist will likely fall over the edge, at least mine did. Also, will there ever be an easier way to open a device than a standard clamshell laptop? The one finger open of the MacBook Air is fast and easy, and as ingenious as the Magic Keyboard's hinge is, it still requires multiple hands and actions to get this thing open. You definitely get the hang of it though, and it certainly feels sturdier than something like a Surface Pro. Neither of these devices have Face ID though, so both require a fingerprint through Touch ID on the corresponding power buttons. But because both of these devices do use the M1, they're both extremely fast to wake. They never skip a beat. But let's get to performance, because the M1 is the focus here on the iPad Air. It's the main thing that's new about it. You can certainly run the benchmarks, and I did, but it won't tell you about how this chip actually feels to run on the iPad Air. Because device for device, the M1 is handled very similarly in both the MacBook Air and iPad Air. They're both passively cooled, so no fans, just the incredible efficiency of the M1. But look, when Apple jumped from Intel to the M1, specifically in the MacBook Air, it was much more dramatic. You could feel the difference in just about everything. But going from the A13 Bionic to the M1 in the iPad Air, it's not nearly as significant. Unfortunately, there basically aren't any one-to-one application-based tests I can run, but in case you're wondering, the M1 is 45% faster than the A13 Bionic in the previous iPad Air. That sounds impressive, but those kinds of gains are only seen in multi-core testing in Geekbench. There's only a 6% difference in single core, so it'll really depend on what you're running if you want to see a difference in performance. That being said, swipes and scrolls feel smoother, switching between apps is virtually seamless, and there are certainly improvements on the graphics side of things. So when it comes to heavier 3D games that could potentially take use of those 8 GPU cores, you'll notice a slight difference. Games like Pokemon Unite, Call of Duty Mobile, and Asphalt 9 all run a little bit smoother and can hit 60 frames per second without an issue. People probably wouldn't have bought an iPad Pro just for a slightly better gaming experience, but the M1 iPad Air doesn't make you pay extra for it. It's just a nice perk. The problem with that is the vast majority of iPad games available in the App Store are made with the typical iPad hardware in mind, so there just isn't a ton of room for the M1 to flex here. Yet. Comparing that to the M1 MacBook Air, the iPad Air is certainly a better gaming device overall. You can do some things on the MacBook Air that you can't on the iPad, such as play Fortnite or Shadow of the Tomb Raider or a number of other AAA Mac games that are available. There just aren't a lot of them, and the M1 can only go so far on them. I'll take the huge amount of touch-enabled games for the iPad Air over the MacBook Air any day, especially since most of them don't run well on the MacBook to begin with. And of course, I have to mention this, most of the applications that actually would take use of the extra performance of the M1 still really aren't available on the iPad. Yes, we're talking about Final Cut, Logic, Xcode, but also Premiere, Photoshop, Lightroom, and many, many more. You can do plenty of fun stuff with the mobile versions of these apps, but they're not full-featured. We already know this. The majority of time spent on a MacBook Air probably isn't in creative applications. It's in web browsing, word processing, video conferencing, those types of things. So let's talk about performance in those applications next. The sponsor of today's video is Baseus, a leading brand of new consumer electronics who has two new products to show off, one for your desktop at home and one for your laptop on the go. The first is the Baseus Power Combo 65 watt, which is a power strip designed for the modern desktop with the power you need and the necessary ports to charge all of the tech you have on your desk. That includes both low and high power desktop devices with all your connections in one convenient place. The Power Combo 65 watt doesn't just treat all these devices equally though. It's designed to deliver optimal supported power for a range of different devices. And thanks to what the company calls a partiated cooling system, it can safely isolate the USB ports from the AC outlets. It all comes in a small package that'll neatly slide under your desk and keep the clutter contained. Baseus also has the 100-watt Blade power bank, a fast-charging battery for your laptop. Take this with your laptop when you're out and about, and you'll get 100 watts of high-power, fast-charging goodness, no matter where you are. It has a sleek 0.7-inch ultra-thin design, which is even thinner than many laptops, despite having a 20,000 milliamp hour battery inside. It even has a convenient digital readout that tells you the remaining battery level, charging power, charging time for the battery itself, and even a light indicator that'll turn on while fast charging. Thanks again to Baseus for sponsoring this video, and if you're interested in any of these products, we have discount codes in the description box below. So I've been using the iPad Air as my main computer for about a week or two now, and there are definitely benefits to using it as your primary computer. You'll need the Magic Keyboard, of course, but once you have that, the iPad Air is an absolute joy to use. I can't stress that enough. The keyboard and the touchpad on the Magic Keyboard are both great, and it's really fun having access to the iPad's excellent touchscreen gestures, especially with the way the angle of the Magic Keyboard brings the screen closer to your fingertips. It's a unique experience that really can't be replicated on a MacBook Air. However, the apps that you use every day will dramatically change the experience of using an iPad. Unfortunately, most of the ones I use every day provided a pretty disappointing experience. Google Docs, it's a great example. It's where I do most of my writing, it's where I wrote this review, and it's a horrible disappointment. You can't select text with a simple click and drag like you can in most apps, and opening links is a huge pain. And then there's Asana, which is a project management application that we use, which still doesn't have the same filtering options in the iPad app and won't open links properly. In both cases, the web app works better than the iPad app, which is a fine substitute, especially now that you can use multiple windows of Safari running side by side in split view. There are still issues with the web apps, of course, but it's a vastly superior experience, even though that's probably not what Apple would prefer you to think. It's not all bad though. On the positive side of things, Outlook for the iPad is awesome, as is Microsoft Word. And of course, if you can live in Apple's software ecosystem, you probably won't be surprised that many of these apps are well optimized for the iPad. And then there's video conferencing, which is an important part of all of our work lives these days. Neither the iPad Air or the MacBook Air are an ideal solution if your day is full of video calls. Performance-wise, there's no problem, but each of their limitations are elsewhere. The iPad Air has the better camera with a crisp 1080p resolution. Unfortunately, the camera is still in the complete wrong place. When locked into the Magic Keyboard, or really any other keyboard, the iPad Air delivers an awkward, unflattering angle. Not quite nose cam territory, but it's to the point where I'd prefer to use a lower quality camera that had a better angle for video calls, like the MacBook Air. Yes, there's center stage, which is meant to help a little bit using the new wide angle lens to follow you around and keep you centered in the frame. It's neat, especially if you're trying to fit multiple people into the picture, but it can't fix the angle of that camera. The other hang up with video conferencing on the iPad Air are the apps themselves. It'll work just fine if you're using FaceTime, but my daily workflow involves multiple video calls in Microsoft Teams each day. And while the app itself is good on its own, there are a couple of annoyances about it that are really hard to get around. For example, you have to have the call on full screen in order to remain on camera. The second you back out, your feed will shut off. In other words, everyone on your call will know that they don't have your full attention. The MacBook Air is overall the better video conferencing device. Obviously, every app functions just as you'd expect, whether they're on desktop or in web apps. The only issue is, again, that it still uses a 720p resolution, unlike those new MacBook Pros. Now, in almost all these app issues and workflow problems, I found workarounds. It's true, after a few days, I got used to the rhythm of using the iPad Air, but I just never felt quite as efficient as on a MacBook Air or really any other laptop. That's especially true if your workflow involves switching constantly between multiple apps like mine does. The moment I switched from the iPad Air back to a MacBook, I realized just how much more productive I felt. And when it comes to work, that's pretty important. Now, leaving behind performance and apps, let's mention some of the physical aspects of the iPad Air that make it different from using the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air and the iPad Air have comparable screens, right around the same pixel density, and they both feature that high P3 color gamut. And seeing them side by side, you really can tell that this is a similar image quality you're getting. Of course, the MacBook Air has a bigger screen and a more standard 16:10 aspect ratio. Because of the 10.5-inch size of the iPad Air screen and because of the 4:3 aspect ratio, a lot of web pages appear squashed from the full width of the page, which is true in sites like our own digitaltrends.com, but also in a lot of web apps, which just displays sort of wonky. Meanwhile, the iPad Air has a couple of obvious advantages over the MacBook Air, namely that it has a touchscreen and all the great gesture support that iPad OS benefits from. Again, using the iPad Air with the Magic Keyboard for some time makes you realize just how silly it is that MacBooks still don't support touch. Combination of keyboard, touchpad, and touchscreen, all well implemented, give you so many ways to navigate and accomplish things. The real problem with the iPad Air in this regard is display connectivity. It has the Thunderbolt port you need, and it even has an extra one thanks to the Magic Keyboard, but iPad OS just doesn't work well with external displays. You can mirror, and that's about it. It's pretty janky. The MacBook Air doesn't do much better in terms of ports outside of the fact that it has a headphone jack, but this is a laptop with macOS's full functioning multiple display support. So if an extra monitor is part of your workflow, the iPad Air just won't do you any good. The good news is the MacBook Air and the iPad Air, again with the Magic Keyboard, both feature fantastic keyboards and trackpads. But due to size alone, the MacBook Air does provide the more comfortable typing experience. Having a full function row is handy, and you don't have to deal with those half-size keys that the iPad Magic Keyboard has to resort to. The same is true of the trackpads. Both are excellent, but the extra size of the MacBook Airs does make it preferable. Side note, I still feel like there's a slight delay in the tracking on the trackpad of the iPad Magic Keyboard, especially for faster movements. There's a drift right before the cursor comes to rest. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's really noticeable up against the MacBook Air or really any other computer. And just to be clear, this is an iPad OS problem, or I guess a design choice, as it is present on the iPad Pro as well. And when you're using different iPad keyboard attachments and different mice, it's everywhere. So not specific to the iPad Air, but I never hear anybody talking about this online, and it was constantly annoying to me. But with all that in mind, here's what it comes down to. If you love the idea of transitioning from something like a MacBook Air to an iPad, of living the laptop-less life, the iPad has never been closer to getting the job done. Between the M1, the Magic Keyboard, and last year's updates to iPad OS, and I guess whatever updates are coming in the future, the iPad Air 5th Gen is a surprisingly good MacBook replacement. If you primarily use cloud storage and web applications, the starting storage configuration of 64 gigabytes might be just enough for you, because even with the Magic Keyboard, that would come in $100 less than the starting MacBook Air. Otherwise, you'll pay an extra $49 more to match the iPad Air against the MacBook Air with that same 256 gigabytes of storage, so it's not technically cheaper. But remember, you're also getting a full functioning tablet with the iPad Air, and that's gotta be worth at least $50, right? But for me, there are a few glaring problems with the apps, the camera, and iPad OS itself that would make me hesitant to recommend the iPad Air over the MacBook Air to the average student or worker. But the gap there isn't as wide as I used to think it was. Hey, if you got all the way to the end, you know what to do. Give this video a like, it really helps us out, and why not hop down into the comments and let me know what you think of this entire comparison. Would you ever consider giving up your laptop for an iPad or another tablet? What would need to change to get you on board? Let me know, and as always, thanks for watching.